I'd like to open it up now for questions, both to you and to Stephen from our committee members. And I think, Veronica, you were the next up. And again, keep the questions crisp.
Will do so. Veronica Wirtz, Boston University School of Public Health. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask. Just very briefly, Spencer and Stephen, questions about your presentation. I might have missed it. I apologize in advance if I have so, but what type of economic studies are available on a return on investment? You talked about the investment made, and then you said this is the performance of the agency. I was wondering what study that was based on, or studies, and I think the committee would be appreciative of any recommendations on references. And then the cost of inaction, if there is similar calculation that has been done by the World Bank, if you are aware of any other models that have been used to cost out what the cost of inaction is. Thank you.
Okay, do you want us to, answer? Okay, I'll start. Spencer can come in. Return on investment. These are very rare in the domestic setting in developing countries. You see more of this, again, on the trade-related capacity side. There are cost-benefit analyses that we've come across on trade-related capacity. On a domestic side, you see them in some individual projects. You see them for some individual dimensions. It's actually quite unusual, though. We at the World Bank, we finance a lot of laboratories, and I haven't really seen a very good sort of return on investment type of analysis in any of the projects that we finance. So it tends then to be more about cost effectiveness rather than return on investment, that trying to find the lowest cost means of achieving a particular result. I don't have an answer on the cost of inaction. Spencer, maybe you want to weigh in?
Oh, there we go. Sorry. Yeah, this is something that we struggled with in the work we did. There are a number of more quantitative, rigorous in inverted commas studies when it comes to high-income countries. Although even there, that tends to be quite limited. But we certainly came to the conclusion that there are a lot of issues with extrapolating that. So we did a lot of back of the envelope calculation type of thing. And our idea of the cost of inaction came very much from this conceptual idea of the life cycle. And that is, if you've got a low income country, then basically what we were saying is, look at where you are going. That is, if you think of that life cycle that we had, that you are going to be going straight up this hump. And so those costs are potentially avoidable by taking action earlier. But at the same time, recognizing that there's this important pathway between need for capacity and level of capacity. So maybe somewhat controversially, we would argue that you can actually have too much capacity at times, that the capacity can actually outweigh, can be ahead of the need for that capacity at any point in time. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Just one other study that comes to mind. So it was joint work between Wageningen University and collaborators from ILRI, and they were looking at India, and it was of this sort of cost of inaction modality. So they did some scenarios on the dietary side and basically had a risk profile for different commodities, and then basically said, look, today there's estimate of 100 million cases of foodborne disease. And if you run out 10 years or 15 years and you look at different dietary change and they modeled basically how the exposure of the population would be looking in 10 or 15 years and what the cost would be at that level. That's the only example I know of. But that type of work, and they were looking at all kinds of multipliers. It's very interesting work, and I think it's the type of work we need to multiply. It's the kind of work that actually can speak to a Ministry of Finance, because it puts out sort of the scenarios and tries to put economic cost numbers on these.
Yeah, well, we'll certainly put that on our list of things to keep in mind of the kinds of studies that would be required. Claire, I think you're next up on question, and then Mikkel.
Okay, Claire Nair, University of Maryland. I just wanted to talk a little bit about, or question, one of our charges is to discuss the transition away from donor aid in terms of food safety. And I think if we go back to Spencer and Steve, you mentioned one of your analytical outreach needs was to identify measures to facilitate private sector action. And I think when Renata was talking about, she brought up the really importance of, at least from a donor side, showing accountability from the countries. But what type of actions or what type of metrics do you think the private sector needs to see to invest more in these countries? This could be open to all three of you.
Renate, why don't you start?
Sorry, Steve, did you?
Yeah, do you want to start and respond to that, or don't give me time to think
no,
about it?
I'd happily. I was hoping to do the same thing, so you start and I'll build on you.
Okay. Look, let me just comment first on development assistance. I've worked in a lot of different areas in related to food and agriculture. Food safety is an especially difficult area of development assistance, in part because of again, once you get outside of the trade, in the trade realm, it's not that difficult. Right? You have clear institutional responsibilities. You have industry leadership. The consequences of getting it right and getting it wrong are obvious, and I think we know what to do. On the domestic side, we have this fragmented structure. I mean, I see Nori there. So Chile is an outlier. I mean, in terms of developing, and now it's an upper income country, in terms of having sort of clear focal institutions that are in the leadership position. So the mandate's divided between, health and agriculture and commerce and municipalities and others. And that's part of the reason why you have a fragmented client, so you have a fragmented development response, because each of these ministries has their own historical ties to different donors. And at the same time, there's not the financial commitment to this subject. And that to us is the most critical thing is that the prioritization of food safety vis-a-vis public health issues is weak in most countries, and vis-a-vis many other aspects of the competitiveness of domestic food industries. And unless we can motivate increased and smarter public investment, all the development assistance in the world is not going to make a huge difference in many countries. So the private sector is clearly of great importance, and as you get into the sort of middle income realm, then you get the basically leadership emerging on the private sector side in terms of governance of food safety through industry associations, through voluntary and other schemes. and government, part of the need from government is to propel forward those initiatives and support them. So look, the benchmarking schemes that exist, and through the Global Food Safety Initiative that benchmarks a number of these schemes and is through its markets program trying to support sort of SME compliance with that. It's a great program, but still relatively limited number of countries in the developing world where it has significant impact right now. And it's scaling that up through, and maybe that is part of support that development assistance can be providing, is to scale up and replicate this programs of upgrading of SMEs in a wider array of low and middle income countries. That's very critical to getting the outcomes we expect to see. Governments have limited capability in many countries, and the private sector has to bear a significant role in seeing improvements in food safety outcomes.
Renata, do you want to build on that?
Just very briefly, because as usual, Steve is very thorough. Look, I do want to say, Claire, in your question, I'd like almost to distinguish what kind of private sector. I mean, the bigger private sector, they have the capacity typically to insulate itself or themselves from incapacities in the national regulatory system. So when you talk about what needs to be done to encourage private sector investment from a food safety capacity point of view, forgetting all of those other things that will determine the lucrativeness of investment. So strictly from a food safety capacities point of view, the big companies can typically insulate themselves from bad capacity. So I wonder if you're talking more about the small businesses and encouraging small businesses to invest. You know, we're in the process of organizing a conference next month on food safety, and one of the discussions I was just having yesterday with one of the panelists is about harnessing market drivers of food safety. You know, what is it that needs to be done to be encouraging small businesses, that there is value in investing in their management systems and in their infrastructure. And okay, mind you, it's a question that I've not completely answered, but the point that Steve raised about the availability of technological support, I think, is an important one. I think the question of making food safety visible, in other words, creating a discerning consumer, is important. I think, and I know that Delia is in the room, I've often wondered about the fairness of competition in a context where there's a highly informal and formal economy, and how we ensure a fairness of competition. In other words, the private sector will say a lot of what they do is to protect their image, their brand, and their credibility. So in a context in countries where there's a large informal as well as a burgeoning formal sector, I think this is a question that I don't know if there are any magic answers, but we have to be aware that they're operating in this context, and this facilitating private sector investment means that there should be a policy environment that seeks to create that fairness in competition.
Last question, Mikel.
Thank you very much. Well, Mikel Arriola from Mexico. I worked for 5 years in the Mexican FDA. And as you know, the task of this committee is to evaluate what has happened after 2012. Something happened in 2011 that was very important for countries like Mexico. And that was the issuance of the Food and Safety Modernization Act that implied that the suppliers of food to the United States had to be certified by the FDA. And if they didn't do that, they could be banned in order to export food to the States. So my question is, what has happened after the issuance of that American law? Because if you address the main objective of that law is to guarantee all the processes of food production in other countries. So what has happened after that, and if we have some data around this new law? Especially for Stephen, if you have something on that.
The number of enterprises that have registered or re-registered, I think, has gone down dramatically, and so I think it's part of a continued process of consolidation where we have haves and have-nots. Mexico is one of the haves, but in terms of the if you look at the distribution of enterprises that are registered with the FDA, just as the distribution of enterprises that are registered with the EU that sort of pre-approved for market access, this is very highly concentrated in 10 or 15 countries. With actually relatively little change over time in terms of entrants. I think Vietnam is a real outlier in the sense that if you look 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the number of enterprises from Vietnam registered under these schemes would have been quite low, and it's now much higher. But the other top 10, 15 countries, it's all the same countries. So I think we're seeing a consolidation within industries that these types of regulatory regimes support. I don't think it affects the aggregate trade, though. I just think it's a distributional impact. So the trade levels on high-value foods and food safety sensitive foods, that trade continues to grow significantly. In some ways, we're seeing more diversion of that trade to other developing countries. I don't know whether that's a deterrent effect of FSMA and other regulations, or that's just chasing demand, where we're seeing the fastest growth in food trade being actually South-South trade in high-value products. So that could be a byproduct of FSMA, although my own view of that it's more the demand driving that part. We haven't looked, I think, in any detail at the specific distribution effects of FSMA itself. That really was sort of outside of our mandate, but it's an important question. The aggregate numbers have plummeted actually, but that may be that many of the companies that were registered before were potential exporters or part-time exporters and didn't feel the cost of doing some upgrades or going through the registration process was worthwhile for continuing their trade.
Great,
Spencer, you may have more on this than me.
I think I agree with what you said, Steve, and we certainly saw a similar thing happen with the European Union. Now, this is historically now, but as it moved to systems of pre-approval of exporters of animal-based foods. And what you tend to find is an initial plummet, you then get some sort of recovery, but also to some extent a churning of exporters. So yeah, we see it elsewhere too.
Good, thank you. Delia has some comments she'd like to make, and I was going to ask Delia, could we take those up after the break? Great, thank you. I'd also like to express for all of us on this committee, to Stephen and Spencer and Renata, our profound thanks for joining us this morning. The information that you've provided, we will be following up with you, I am sure, for more information, more details. And we are very appreciative of your willingness to spend some extra time to answer the questions from the committee. So thank you all. And we'll take a 5-minute break and reconvene at 10:30.
Thanks. Great, thank you.